Hi there, I'm Sam Moser. I'm currently rebuilding this camper van. This video is going to follow along as I rebuild the subfloor, or the base of the camper. I've got my main materials for this right here, which is rigid foam insulation and some plywood that's going to go on top of that. I'll cover other materials that I use as we go along. And with that said, let's get started. The previous iteration of this subfloor screwed down into these wooden strips that I glued here onto the metal at the bottom of the van. And in my teardown video, I tested how well these were secured on there, and they're on there really good. They were super hard to pry off. So I'm going to leave them in place and just build my new floor on top of that. I do need to do a bunch of cleanup to the floor though. Like, all these strips are filled with staples. I'm going to pull those out. I need to give the whole thing a general cleaning. I need to patch some holes in the floor. Probably going to paint these wood strips just for some extra protection. So basically, a lot of prep work before I get to actually building the new floor on top of this, which I think is the more interesting part. So I'm just kind of going to go quick through the prep work. The other reason why I'm going to leave all these wood strips in place is because the floor of this van is super dented up. And so by building on top of these strips that I already have glued down to the low points, I'll be able to get the flattest surface to build upon. What I don't like about having the wood strips here on the low points of the floor versus the way I prefer to build subfloors now with putting the strips across all the high points on the floor is just if any water or anything does work its way under the floor, it's more likely to sit in contact with that wood, with these being in the low parts of the floor. And that's why in this redo, I'm going to go ahead and paint over these just for some added protection from that in the future.
Before getting started on the floor, I decided to pull out these main sections of my old wall framing. It all unbolted easily and came out as 3 large sections. I probably won't be reusing these, and having it out will make it easier to clean up the gunk down at the floor edges. This is the buildup of spray foam and silicone that was previously used to seal up the bottom edges of the floor. I cleaned that up so I could start with fresh edges for the new floor. After this, I gave the whole floor a general clean and scrubbed at some areas where some dirt had collected. There were a few spots with small rust stains that didn't come up near where holes had been drilled in the floor, so I treated these with some Rust-Oleum metal primer.
Next up, I'm going to cut and re-glue a couple pieces of the wood supports here down at the bottom that had gotten ripped up when I tore out the subfloor. The rest seemed to be holding on really well. The ones that came out were ones where I forgot to take the screw out as I was prying the floor up, and so it was just being pulled up with a lot of force basically, but the rest seemed to be held on pretty good. Additionally, while I have a tube of adhesive open, I'm going to go ahead and patch a couple holes in the floor that I need to patch, and I'm going to do that using some aluminum flashing. And I think this is a good option for a cover material because, one, it's aluminum, so it's not going to rust out or corrode, and two, it's fairly flexible, so you can bend it if you need to match the curve of like one of the ribs in the floor. And both the ones I need to patch have a little bit of a bend I need to do to them. So I'm going to see how this works.
This tube of window weld had way too much of the tip cut off, so it was coming out pretty messy, but this is all going to get covered. All that matters is that it's sealed up well. I thought the aluminum flashing worked quite well for making these patches.
In this area right behind the front seats, I'm going to be adding a passenger seat. And that passenger seat will be a standard Ford Transit back seat that came from a passenger van, and it mounts using these seat rails. So I need to drill my holes in the floor here that these seat rails will mount to. I already have pilot holes drilled for where the holes are going to go. I just need to open that up to the full size hole. And I'll do that using a step bit on the drill here, and I put some masking tape on the step bit just so I know which level to stop drilling at, and then I'll go ahead and, after each one, do a test to make sure it's the right size with a 1/2-inch bolt. To determine the location where I'm mounting these seat rails, I've put the seat in here with the rails on it and just tried to find the balance of having the seat in a position where it left enough leg room behind the front seat, but also was far enough forward that it gave the most space behind it for the rest of the build. And then beyond that, I had to adjust the position of where these brackets are going based on what's underneath the van, because under there I need to have room to sandwich on a backing plate that goes underneath the floor. I'll show more on putting the seat on later, but for now, as part of this floor prep stage, I just need to open up these holes.
After drilling the holes, I used a metal deburring tool to clean up the edges. I'll also paint the edges of these holes later to prevent rust of the freshly exposed metal edges.
On 2 of these holes back here, the floor is actually a little thicker, and what that meant is the step bit couldn't go all the way through just on one of its steps, and rather than making the top of the hole wider than it needs to be, I'm just going to switch to a normal drill bit for that section. The thing is, though, is there is some stuff right here that I don't want to hit if I drill too far underneath the van, and with the step bit, it wasn't really a problem because the bit's pretty short, it's like a little cone. But with the normal drill bit, once it pops through, it can just kind of go down, and it's hard to control. So a simple way to handle that is to get a little chunk of PVC and slide that over the drill bit. And this essentially just acts as a stop collar, so now as you're drilling the hole, once the end of the drill bit pops through, the PVC is going to stop it from going too far. At this point, I'm going to start cutting the framing that's going to sit underneath my plywood subfloor layer. And I'll refer to this framing as like the subframing. Here I have a few 2x6s, and this is what I'm going to cut my pieces from, but I'm going to cut them into pieces the equivalent of 2x2s or 2x3s. I just don't like to buy wood in those smaller sizes because it usually comes pretty warped and twisted, and if you buy the larger boards, they're a little flatter, a little straighter. After I rip these to the widths I want, I then need to plane them down to get them thinner. So right now they're 1.5 inches thick, but the insulation that I'm going to sandwich between them is only 1 inch thick in this case. So I'll just run them through the planer until I get their thicknesses to match.
I used the planer to get the boards down to 1 inch thick. I could have also just done this on the table saw, and honestly that probably would have been quicker, but this worked too and gave each board a really consistent thickness. Once they were planed, I could start cutting each board and laying them out inside the van. I picked the locations based on where I wanted extra support under the floor. I didn't prioritize having an even 4-foot spacing between the crosswise supports as it wouldn't have lined up as well with the wheel wells, but doing so would reduce the number of cuts in the plywood sections that would go above this. After laying out and fitting all the pieces, I brought them into the shop and drilled pocket holes to secure them all together. I then started assembling everything together using some liquid nails, fused adhesive, and the pocket hole screws. In hindsight, I would have preferred just using wood glue for this, but I grabbed this tube because again, I had already had a partial tube of it opened from another project. I worked my way across the floor. I'll glue and screw this subframe to the strips underneath later, but for now I'll just leave it resting on top and start cutting out the plywood layer that goes on top of it. I'm using 3/4 inch AC radiata pine plywood for this, which as far as construction grade plywood goes, it's very uniform and stable. AC means it has one side rated A, without knots or voids, and one side rated C, which has some knot holes. I'll face the A side up so we have a smoother surface for our flooring that'll go on top. I broke down my full sheets using the track saw, and then cut them to width on the table saw. This front section is the only one that is a simple rectangle. The rest will need to get cut to the shape of the van, but I saved my previous insulation layer to use as a template. I laid out the foam inside and made some marks on the boards with where the cross pieces of the frame are, as these are where the plywood seams will need to align. Then I set the remaining floor pieces together outside, lined up my reference marks with the seams between plywood pieces, and traced the shape onto the plywood. Some of my previous cuts were more oversized than I liked, so I made new marks to create a tighter fit. After making these initial cuts, I brought each piece in for a test fit, and in most cases, I needed to take it back out and trim some more off to get the fit correct. In the back, I extended the floor all the way to the doors to get a few extra floor inches versus stopping it behind the rear pillars. If you do this, you do need to create an access hole for the spare tire release mechanism. I'll show cutting out that hole later. For now, here's how all the plywood sections look.
Alright, so let's catch up on where we are up to this point. So underneath my plywood here, I have that subframe built, but it's not connected down yet. Then I cut all my plywood subfloor pieces and fit them into place. The last thing I need to do before this floor is ready to kind of glue all together and put in permanently is I need to do some prep around where the seat brackets are going to go up in the front. And by that I mean I need to make cutouts in the floor where I can recess those brackets because those have to sit directly on the metal at the very bottom. You never want to put a seat bracket above another layer of flooring. Since I already have the holes drilled in the floor for those, I can go underneath the van and take a marker and mark where those holes out, and then it'll be easy to know where I need to cut the plywood because I can just align the bracket onto those marks on the plywood. I'm also going to build like a little box or support around the area where that bracket's going so that nothing can kind of fall in and get under the floor in that area. I want it to be sealed off and also just look good. Then once I have the boxes around those seat brackets built out, I can begin the final assembly. So with everything out, I'll glue that subframe in, I'll add the insulation between it, and then I'll lay down glue and screw and glue down these upper plywood panels. Alright, let's get back to it.
These strips will form boxes around the seat bracket area. The crosswise pieces need a cutout to fit the floor contour, which I'll cut on the bandsaw. I used wood glue and staples to assemble the boxes. Back in the van, I cleaned the floor area to get it ready to glue these down, and then I set the brackets in place and dropped bolts in to fully align them. Then I laid a bead of construction adhesive on the underside of the box and adhered it in place. I used extra adhesive to seal off the inside corners. The height of these matches the height of the wood subframe to create a stable and level surface on top. I wanted to make sure that the plywood layer above had support around where these brackets are going. At this point, I'm finally ready to do the final assembly of each floor layer, so I'll start by taking everything out. Next, I'm going to paint these wood strips on the lowest part of the floor. I didn't show this step before, but during my earlier work on the floor, I had decided to also use caulking to seal along the bottom edge of each of these wood strips. If I'm taking the time to paint it for extra protection, I may as well do this step too. This is just a preventative measure to protect against the scenario where some water makes it under the floor, since these base strips sit in the low points of the floor instead of the high points of the floor ribs.
I got my base layer here covered with a coat of primer, and it's had about a day and a half to dry, so I'm ready to move on with the next steps of putting everything on top of it. For good measure, I went ahead and used a primer that has some mold inhibitor in it, and again, that's just because I'm worried about the strips that are in the low points of the floor, so I just wanted them to have as much protection as possible. For gluing the subframe to the floor and then the plywood to that subframe, I'm going to use some Sikaflex 221, and this will be in combination with some screws that also go from that subframe into these wood strips, and then from the plywood subfloor layer into that frame. And then for securing my rigid foam insulation in between the subframe, it'll mostly just kind of press and fit in place, but I'll also use some spray foam kind of under it and around the edges and anywhere it needs a little extra hold. Alright, here we go. This thing is a little bit clunky to move, but not too bad. So I need to put my adhesive underneath this, but first I need to get it positioned exactly where I want it so I can mark out where to put the adhesive, and then I'll lift it up a little to put that in. I'm also thinking it'll probably be a good idea to get it lined up how I want it and then go ahead and put a couple screws in first. That'll then undo, and those can just act as reference points, so then when I am squishing it down with the adhesive, sometimes glues and things make whatever you're gluing down want to slide a little bit, so I'll have kind of reference holes, or if I realign those screws, I'll have it in the same place I want it.
I propped the frame up on some paint cans so I could spread the adhesive. I'm using Sikaflex 221 for this. Once the adhesive was spread, I lowered the frame back down so I could begin screwing it down, starting with the previously made reference screws. After this, I could pre-drill and add screws throughout the rest of the frame. I pre-drilled with a countersink bit to ensure all the screw heads sank below the surface. With the frame glued in place, I could start on the insulation. I'm using 1-inch XPS rigid foam insulation for this.
There's a lot of ways you can cut this foam board, but the easiest way is to score a line with a utility knife. And then you can basically just snap it along that line, so bring it over to the edge and then just, and it breaks pretty cleanly, and most importantly, it doesn't make a huge mess when you do that, like if you try to cut it with a saw or by some other means. So Simple, clean cuts.
I need to pop in with a quick note. In hindsight, the spray foam wasn't the best thing for using to give a little extra hold under that rigid foam. It was fine for sealing any edges on gaps along the sides of the foam, but not the best for underneath. That's because the foam continues to expand for really quite a while as it's drying, which it kept pushing up the insulation. It had enough force to do that. So I was constantly having to kind of fight it and go around and push panels back down to keep everything as flat as possible. In the end, it all came out mostly fine, but there were a few spots where I did kind of have to go trim the foam because it got pushed up a little too much at an edge. In the past, I've used this spray foam construction adhesive for this, and this works a lot better because it doesn't continue to expand so much as it's drying. A few dabs of just a normal construction adhesive would have worked as well, but honestly, if all the pieces have a tight fit, you probably don't really even need anything to give a little extra hold on them. I always am just leery about something that may cause squeaks, and so I know that having it all adhered together as best as possible is going to reduce squeaks, and that's why I wanted to put a little something extra. Most of the pieces of XPS fit pretty tight, but where there were edge gaps, I filled them with some spray foam. Once the foam is fully cured, it can be trimmed flush with the long utility knife. On this back panel, I need to drill an access hole for the spare tire release since I brought the floor all the way back to the far back edge. After measuring and marking where to drill, I cut through the plywood with a hole saw.
With the framing and insulation layer complete, I brought all these plywood panels back in and laid them in place. Now I haven't laid down any glue or screws or anything under this yet, and that's because I wanted to bring them all in and lay them out so I could make sure like all the seams were tight and they were aligned at all the edges how I wanted. And then one at a time, I'll pull a section out, lay my adhesive down, screw it in, and then do the next one. And once I have that first one in, then I can just keep butting my seams tight together and work off of that.
I'm again using Sikaflex 221 here. I marked where the supports were underneath and then drilled countersunk pilot holes before adding screws. Once each piece was glued and screwed down, I turned my attention to the seat bracket areas. To screw down around the floor bracket cutouts, I first had to measure and mark where the box underneath was. I did this by measuring under the plywood and then transferring this measurement onto the top. I was then able to mark out where the support box was underneath so that I could add screws in the right locations. To get a clean and flush cut around these openings, I used a flush trim bit on a router. Cutting out the openings for these brackets undersized initially and then using the router to open them up the rest of the way made it easy to make sure they were properly aligned.
After putting in this last floor panel, I waited a bit and took a break before coming back with the router and routing out these boxes for my seat brackets. I wanted it to be mostly dry because I figured a little bit of adhesive probably squeezed out and I didn't want that to gunk up my router bit or just make a mess. I'm happy with how these little recessed areas came out. The seat bracket fits in there pretty cleanly with some wiggle room for adjusting it while I'm bolting it down. I'll bolt these down later. You do have to drop the fuel tank in order to get access where you need to on the underside for the bolts here. The last thing I'll do to these recessed areas at this point is I'm just going to use some black Rust-Oleum spray paint to just paint the inside of these boxes black so that it'll all kind of blend together with the bracket. And then later on when I put flooring on top of this, I'll probably add a little trim as well as make some covers that sit within this recessed area. I built this floor a little thicker than I normally would. I used an inch of insulation followed by 3/4 inches of plywood. And I did that to get enough height that these seat brackets could sit under the top of the floor. So that way, if the seat is out and I wanted to build covers to hide these, I could. From the highest point on the bracket here to the top of the floor, there's about a 1/4 inch. So I could get a little piece of 1/4 inch material, put my flooring material on top of that, and make a little cover that just drops in place. With the interior height in transits, as long as you're not super tall, you can make a floor that's a little thicker and still have plenty of headroom. Alright, I'm getting close on wrapping up this kind of floor build. The last thing I'm going to do is put some spray foam at the edges and then I'll trim that flush just to fill in the gap between the edges of the floor and the walls. I haven't picked out what kind of flooring I'm going to use in here yet, so that along with kind of trim around the edges will come in a later video. Alright, let's keep moving. With that excess foam trimmed around the edges, that's it for what I'm going to do on the floor for now. Once I put the flooring in, I'll also do some sealant around the edges, but that'll come later. But for now, this floor feels good. It's nice and solid. You know, because it's got that frame underneath it, there's no wobble, there's no deflection near any of the seams, so I feel good about the floor. Next up, I'm going to turn to these seat brackets, so I'm going to move the van, get it jacked up on some blocks so I can drop that fuel tank and get all those bolted on.
I'm using 1/2 inch by 1.5 inch bolts here, and all the hardware is grade 8 hardware for extra strength. Underneath the brackets, I made backing plates from aluminum to spread the load over a wider area of the floor. The backing plate on this outside bracket catches the lip of the frame member next to it, so I also had to create a shim plate so the main plate sits totally flat.
Alright, go to back.
I also added some Loctite before putting on the washer and a nylon lock nut. For the inside bracket, the fuel tank has to get unbolted and lowered to have enough working room to add the bolts and backing plates. It was too hard to film in this tight area under the van, so here's what all the mounting locations looked like once everything was assembled together. Finally, the seat can snap into place. The seat is crazy heavy to move, but it can be pulled on and off from the brackets fairly easily. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Bye.